Imhotep, and welcome to the Kemetic Storytellers. Since this is our very first show, I'd like to tell you a little about ourselves and what we're doing here before we get started. As our name suggests, we're a group of people who follow the Kemetic, that is, ancient Egyptian, faith. We've come together to write and share stories of the gods and goddesses of Kemet. The glyphs for our show literally translate into, "We tell the tales of Kemet." We hope that the stories we tell here will spread some knowledge and understanding of the gods and goddesses, while being entertaining and fun at the same time. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. The Kemetic Storytellers present Beauty and the Beak, written by Arieni Hethert, read for you by Mose, with Perry, Zoe, and Corey. Art by Imke. It was a cold, dark time in Kemet. One day, her heart was gone, fast as you can blow out a lamp, and just as gloomy. You could see it on every face. The way the people snarled at each other, the way babies could never quite be comforted enough. The whole land was on edge, like a caffeine freak jittering at the counter of an all-night diner. Love had gone, and left us all high and dry. It was only a matter of time before the whole place exploded. Only one guy knows for sure what set her off. Her father. My friend. The king of gods, and all humanity. I knew it was only a matter of time before I got the call, and he didn't waste much time. He was vague, upset, but the details were plain enough. They fought, and she split. He begged her not to leave, but he couldn't rein in that eye for love or money. So she pulled her Jekyll and Hyde routine and raged away across Kemet and past her borders, butchering anyone who crossed her path. No one could touch her, but I had to. My name's Djehuty. Today, I'm a baboon. The God King sent me and my partner Shu to bring her back. It was a crazy assignment, but you don't argue with a God King. Not loud enough for him to hear you, anyway. I was armed only with my wits and some knockout juice brewed up by an interested third party. I wasn't sure if I hoped to have the chance to use it or not. Beauty was on the lam, and an angry dame moves fast. Months of cold trails and false leads finally led us further upstream, closer and closer to the source of the river itself. I called it the Place of Finding, and the name stuck. We just got a hot tip that one little village was looking especially bright and cheerful for this time of year. I sent Shu on ahead, while I shook down a few more informants. But after a day, he went silent. No messages, signals, nothing. Something had gone south, and it wasn't just the lady. I beat feet on past this place, picked this village and this bar for their complete lack of charm. She hadn't been through town yet, but I knew her too well. Everybody knows she's never met a bar she didn't like, but me, I know why. Just as I expected, she made her appearance around noon. She walked in like she owned the place, and for all intents and purposes, she did. Her form was mostly human now, but she still wore her lioness face, teeth bared. Her dress was ragged and stained with dried blood of all the poor saps who'd happened upon her in a moment of fury. It was worse than I'd expected. Her appearance was not something she neglected, except in the worst of her rages. We'd all seen it before, and I'd hoped it hadn't gotten this bad. She must be in a good mood now, though. I watched quietly from the corner, the little jar holding her one-way ticket to Happy Land tucked under my arm, biding my time. The temperature in the dim hut climbed, perspiration suddenly appearing on exposed skin and dampening skirts and dresses, but no one seemed to notice the heat. The people, none of them consciously aware of the danger that had just walked in, and unable to put a finger on what calamity was poised to erupt among them at any moment, nonetheless felt the tension. It was written on their faces, wrapped in their defensive postures. She was right on the edge. The hovel itself and everyone inside waited for the other sandal to drop. She walked slowly to the bar, leaned against it in silence, and the barkeep gingerly offered her a beer, without even looking at her. She turned, cup in hand, and swept her eyes around the room until they landed square on me. She knew it was me. No one else could have gotten this far, or even dared to seek her out at all. I waited until she took a long, deep drink before I approached. As the drink began to take the edges off her teeth, the whole place seemed to relax. I steeled myself and leapt up onto the bar. Close, but not too close. I held my left arm close, as if it had been injured, to conceal my parcel.
What's with the monkey suit?
Not monkey. Baboon. Do you like it?
I puffed myself up to better display my features.
Nice. Did you dress up just for me?
Doesn't everyone?
She rolled her eyes in reply. I felt her gaze settle on my arm.
Looks like you had a little accident.
I've had worse.
I replied while trying to act like the fake pain of the fake injury didn't bother me. Before she could get too curious, I changed the subject.
Speaking of fashion, for all your unstructured couture and terrifying visage, I must say you still glow. The very definition of beauty. How do you do it?
Sassy, but not smarmy, I hoped.
Whatever you're here to say it fast and get out.
Though she spoke to her drink, I heard her just fine. She looked angrier than she sounded. I could work with that.
I'm here to take you home.
I said as I settled in just out of arm's reach.
You think mighty highly of yourself.
She gave an unsettling chuckle and tightened her hand on her cup. Not a good sign.
I have to. There's no one else lining up to do it for me.
I smiled.
You still got that smart mouth.
She turned her blood-curdling smirk towards me, but she's not the only one who can play cool.
That's not the only smart thing I've got. I found you, didn't I?
You had help.
Her voice was cold, tired, but not malicious. He was still alive.
That's a good point. Where is my help?
Comfortable.
She turned to me and grinned, at once alluring and terrifying. Get too close to that smile, and anyone could lose their mind, and then, well, all academic after that. Some ladies, no one can just walk away from. Used to be, that was a good thing. Today, it was still up in the air. Everything was still up in the air. My fur bristled along my spine, and I hoped she didn't have a good view of it.
That's more of a how than a where.
I held my ground, but made a mental note of which window would be the most convenient to make use of if negotiations needed to be postponed.
He's just outside.
She snapped. My eyes moved involuntarily towards the exit, looking for a sign of my friend's well-being.
Move toward that door and no one's going home tonight.
She was impatient and unamused, but she was still talking, and like it or not, she was already cooperating a little.
You asked the wrong questions.
She set her drink down hard and stared at the bar for a moment.
Just the ones that I want answered.
I tried to keep my voice light without any more smiling. No sense provoking the predator. I carefully propped my elbows up on my knees and folded my hands together in a vague sort of pleading gesture. She ignored me and walked from the bar to lean against the wall near my escape window, where she spent some long moments looking out at the unusually verdant neighborhood. The green was new since she showed up, and was still wrapped in the haze of dust that was this place's typical decor. The sight of green seemed to soothe her a little, for which I was grateful, but the lioness still held sway. She looked back at me, eyes brimming with bitterness.
I'm not going back.
The words rumbled from deep in her throat, carrying miles of resentment and just a hint of her former gentleness. She wasn't talking to me, but her eyes pierced me all the same.
Why don't we have another drink and talk this out?
The barkeep refreshed her drink and brought another for me. I picked up the cup, studiously casual, and pretended to pay more attention to drinking than her sulking. I knew she was watching. She was always watching, thinking. More people wandered into the bar, more chatter in the background, but her quiet voice rose right to my ears.
It doesn't matter. I'm done. No games, nothing to question, nothing to answer.
She shook her head, eyes closed. No, this wouldn't work. I needed to keep her in this game, at least a while longer.
What could he have possibly said to you? What could you have possibly argued about that could have driven you to this?
Her nostrils flared, and her eyes opened to squinting, smoldering slits in response.
I've had just about enough of you, Big Nose.
If you're trying to wound my pride, I assure you, sister, that you are barking up the wrong tree.
She growled and stepped away from the wall back toward me. Wrong move. I deflated a bit, held my hands up in adoration. I bowed slightly as I tried to put a little more space between us without falling off the bar or losing my line to the window.
I know, you're nobody's sister. You're the dream and the nightmare, the disease and the cure. I get that. It's cool. But I know you, and I know what you are, and I know what you are not. You are no femme fatale.
Her growls increased as she stepped closer. At the other end of the bar, two men began to shove each other, shouting in louder and louder voices. She advanced, oblivious. She knew she already had me in her jaws. The distance, the attack, the tearing were just formalities. I could almost hear her leg muscles tensing for a leap. Over her shoulder, I could see movement just outside the window. A scarred lioness walking by, carrying something in her mouth. What was she doing in the middle of the village? But then I saw she carried a message disguised as lunch. A baboon head. The lady never was very subtle when she was in a bad mood. Now I may not actually be a baboon, but I hate to see one of my friends laid out like that. It's the natural order, sure, but it's still a drag. A baboon could really mess up a lion on a good day. But even if this was that good day, she knew my heart wasn't in it. The only prayer a primate's got is blind fury, and I didn't have that luxury. I did the math, and going bananas in self-defense might save my hide, but I'd have a lot of explaining to do when Daddy heard what went down. No, I had to try something else, and fast.
Alright, you are.
I said, still holding my hands in Henu.
Technically, but you don't have to be. Look at this place. When you walked in, it looked like a verse out of a Bad Harbor song. You've got everyone smiling, and even the usual odors of drink-induced effluvia have been replaced by the perfume of flowers outside. Flowers that weren't even there before you arrived.
The bar was silent, every breath held tight. There was no way to lay it on too thick under the circumstances.
Everyone forgets their cares when you smile on them. Even when you mope near them, everyone's suddenly happy, and they don't even know why. You can't help it. Joy blooms in your wake. Whether you like it or not, you are powerful. Dangerous even. But you aren't cruel.
Bingo. She stopped on the verge of her lunge and looked out the window again. The scarred lioness had thankfully moved on. Across the room, the almost fist fight broke up into laughter and applause. Someone started passing around drinks, and a song erupted among the would-be brawlers.
Please come home. Your people and your family need you. They promise all of this, and so much more. For you, every day, forever and ever.
I swept one paw toward the shindig. She watched the cavorting, which began to swirl closer to her again. She looked sad.
These are my people too. How can I go and let this place turn back into a dump? It just doesn't seem fair.
She sighed at last. She watched the carousers going about their drunken business. Flutes and other instruments appeared seemingly from nowhere, and the sounds of conversation were soon joined by beautiful, if bawdy, music. The party was the perfect distraction. I crept closer, opened the tiny jar, and slipped a little something to take the last of those edges off into her cup, while she marveled at the sudden festivities. Her demanding eyes settled on me at last. I shrugged.
I didn't say you had to stay home. Just don't stay away.
Her smile then, gentle as a breeze, spoke more than she ever would out loud. She saw it. I was right. They always come around eventually, but I was still glad I had brought along a little insurance.
You're not their dame, or my dame. You don't belong to anyone, but we all need you. Home. Sometimes.
She walked back to the bar, a new determination in her posture. With each step, her features looked softer, and the already ebullient crowd became more crowded, more ecstatic. She picked up her cup, brought it to her lips, and stopped. I tried to look bland, yet curious, but she could always see right through me. Should I run to a more strategic location? I was well within swiping distance. Should I cause a commotion? Break up the party and sneak into the chaos and regroup?
You slipped me a Mickey,
she said as she peered deeply into the cup. It was a matter-of-fact statement, perhaps a little surprised, but as if by a tiny, harmless insect. I held my breath. I didn't bother trying to look innocent anymore. Whether she saw me do it or she smelled it lurking in her beer, she didn't say. Maybe she always knew I had it on me, and she was just playing games with me now. She turned to face me, leaned closer, and drank it all down in one long swallow, eyes piercing me the whole time. I got the message loud and clear. Nothing happens to the lady without the lady's approval. I was equal parts chagrined and relieved to not be eaten. Commotion by the door provided welcome relief for my wounded pride. Shu, panting and still partly tangled in ropes, staggered inside. His kilt was filthy, as if she had dragged him around in the dirt, and that feather he liked to wear in his hair protruded from a matted mess of hair at the side of his head. He sneered at the room, his murderous glare going ignored by the humans, until he found her. He charged right up to her, ready to split nails by the looks of him.
Why, I oughta...
Before he could finish, she giggled and gave him an affectionate pat on the cheek, then planted a big kiss right on his lips. As she leaned back, it was plain to see that whatever bomb he was ready to set off had been diffused.
No, I can't stay mad at you.
He half grumbled as a dopey grin pulled at the corners of his mouth.
Good timing,
I said to him. He shrugged in a daze. Man, it was a sight to see her work.
Let's go, boys,
she said, setting the cup down with a graceful flourish.
I need a bath.
I know just the place. Doll.
Good. And we're still a few hundred miles from you being able to call me doll and live.
Right.
I smoothed my fur.
There's an island just north of here that is perfect for bathing. I even know a tailor there.
You're speaking my language.
She grabbed us each by the hand and escorted us from the bar toward the northern side of the village.
Speaking of language, I've really missed having you around to translate for me. My job has been complete hell since you've been gone. Happy people are so much more compliant.
Oh, work. Don't remind me.
She said with mock annoyance.
So, really, how did you find me?
You know, you're cute when you're curious.
She always made me fess up, whatever strange little thing she had noticed. I can't say I liked having to come clean so many times in one day, even if it was for a good cause.
Don't change the subject.
Even without the fury, it's never easy to say no to those eyes.
That's easy.
I grinned.
The only thing you like better than being surrounded by beauty is redecorating.
Bring the Flood, written by Arieni Hethert, read for you by Tepta, with Keneferitu Helms, Merritt, Ikunyi, and Corey. Artwork by Imke.
Hethert returned to the palace at dawn, appearing as fresh as if she had just emerged from her palanquin and not walked all the way from Edfu overnight. The procession that followed them from Philae still swarmed merrily around the palace, but inside its walls the jubilation was more orderly. She found him without effort, as if it had been the plan this whole time for them to reunite in this hallway, at this moment, with the sun only just beginning to turn the sky from lapis to pink-edged turquoise. She didn't pause, didn't break stride, until she was in his arms. Her companions made no attempt to hide their exhaustion, and after paying their respects to the king, soon left him alone with his child. They held each other in silence, a tactile conversation on the rightness of their reunion. They could not hold each other tight enough, it seemed.
How do you always know where I will be on this day?
We are all creatures of habit in our own way.
I have missed you.
I know.
She rested her head on his shoulder.
So what have you been doing without me?
Restoring balance. You and I, we wrought a terrible violence across the land. I have repaired what I can. The people need laws to guide them now, structured ways of them handling any future rebellions without our intervention.
His voice carried both the weight of and pride in his work.
But you already know that. What do you have to say for yourself?
His severe tone matched the hard set of his jaw, but his eyes, he knew, betrayed his joy and relief. She stood up on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek.
Love you.
He held her tight, and she held him tighter. The typical noises of the daily palace routine slipped away as Ra sighed, smiling for the first time in months.
One day, the first day, there was a flood that was not a flood, for there was nothing to call it flood. The flood was the sky and the ground. It was everything that could ever be, and it was you, my daughter. You were so much older then. I was a blossom rising from my secret roots, reaching for the surface. But there was no surface. And you, knowing who I was and who I would be, you lifted me from the water and became new water, the water of the sky, so that I might emerge at last and shine. And here we are.
He looked down to see Hethert's eyes closed, the visions still playing in her mind. She savored the sights, the sounds of her father's speech. She hadn't stopped smiling since she arrived, and while most would not have noticed the difference, he saw the last trace of tension ease from the corner of her mouth. His daughter was well and truly home now. Her eyes popped open at last, as if on cue.
I love that story,
she said, nestling her head under his chin.
We do this every year,
he said. He was not angry or even putting up that appearance anymore.
Yes, we do.
It makes me tired.
I know it does,
she replied, neither gloating nor remorseful. Hethert kissed her father again and waved as she headed to her rooms. As beautiful as she could make the grime of travel appear, everyone knew she would spend the rest of the morning returning herself to her full glory. Relief and weariness both followed Ra as he left Hethert to prepare for the feast that would be held in her honor that evening. They followed him through his rituals and his appointments and refused to let him set them down anywhere.
A drought comes and you must protect us.
The man's voice rose in pitch and volume with each word. He was dangerously close to violating protocol, but Ra ignored it for the moment.
My home was devastated in the last dry year, and our crops this year have already suffered from blight. You must reduce our tribute so that we will not starve.
Though the nomarch was not allowed to approach too closely, not when he had already ignored normal channels for securing an audience with the king, Ra could see the panic clearly, panic that he had seen all too often since putting down the rebellion among his subjects. The speed with which fear overtook his children in his presence fueled the ache in his heart.
Calm yourself, friend. Drought is a matter of concern for the whole nation, and Kemet will not feast on the flesh of its own right arm. I know your wife has had troubling dreams, and I do not doubt her ability to see things truly, but our own oracles have said nothing at all about drought. Perhaps she saw another year, another dryness? We were until just this morning suffering the effects of a different sort of lack, one just as painfully felt as a lack of water.
The nomarch harumphed and crossed his arms. Ra found it hard not to smile at the man's rudeness, remarkably alive in spite of fear still showed in his posture. He always found it strange how his people could overlook their own strength while distracted by a dark emotion. He did at last allow himself a smile, warm and comforting as he spoke.
The two lands honor you and your people. I will consult a further oracle on your concerns about the river. Will you abide by this oracle?
I will, my king.
He prostrated himself and left without another word, his eyes averted. Ra found Moot in her private audience chamber. The room was small and attractive, with a modest throne on a modest dais. Beautiful but relatively unadorned compared to many such rooms in the palace. He watched quietly for a moment, the expected throng of activity. A well-ordered current of scribes, assistants, and servants swirling around his daughter as she accepted offerings, commented on documents, gave instructions, and in due time, and sooner than he expected, acknowledged the presence of the observing king. He watched the dance wind down as its dancers scattered to other tasks with barely a gesture from Moot. He approached and rested a hand on her shoulder for a moment.
Daughter of my two eyes, seeing you at work is always a marvel,
he said, smiling as he caressed her face. Moot shrugged.
They offer me perfection, and I reflect it. What troubles you on this happy day, Lord?
Hethert has returned, yes, but some of the people are uneasy. They dream of a coming drought. If this is true, or if this fear, however unfounded, spreads...
He stopped, exasperated.
The rebellions, for there will always be one or another, break your heart.
She nodded, sympathetic and pragmatic at once.
There is no shame in that. Were they my tears, I would be stung by their rejection too. Consult Wesir. Has never been as you are, set so high above to be revered, inspiring awe and terror. But they are at ease with him. He knows well the people's hearts.
Ra nodded, thoughtful.
And you, bearer of crowns, you also know of hearts. You know the hearts of the gods, the heart of Maat. You know this land as well as any other, perhaps better. I have a question for you. Does the flood come? Will it arrive on time in the new year?
There are more popular oracles,
but none more sovereign. You speak with the authority of both crowns. If you see it, you will be believed. After all, you didn't just send a plague on anyone.
Moot raised an eyebrow at the remark, but rose to comply. She removed her crown and set it in her place on the throne as she turned to the king.
Flood.
Ra nodded. She looked at him silently for several moments and then moved away, walking around him, circling slowly as she spoke again.
Then there was flood that was not a flood, for there was nothing to call it flood. The flood was the sky and the ground, and it was everything that could ever be, and it was you, my king. You were a blossom rising from your secret roots that none but Ausar know, reaching for the surface, but there was no surface. And so your mother, the abundant waters, knowing who you were and would be, lifted you from the old, familiar waters and became new waters, the waters of the sky, so that you might emerge at last and shine.
She grimaced so slightly then that Ra was not sure he had seen it before she slipped from his side again.
Reassure him that his indonation will indeed come this year, and that it will be perfection, providing such bounty that no one will have any trouble paying its tribute and all of its debts to its neighbors. If he still doubts, tell him that it is I who shall ensure his prosperous fields, and that I will expect his thanks.
She said, as she finished her circuit to stop before him.
But you, Lord, there is no flood coming to you. It is a different season. You must go to it.
She drifted back to her seat and retrieved her crown. She placed it on her head with practiced grace, bowed to the king, and backed respectfully toward the doorway. Ra remained behind. He looked out the small window and across the courtyard and saw Wesir, laughing, clap a hand on the back that once angry nomarch, a smile on the man's face as the two spoke.
How does he do that?
Ra muttered under his breath.
Perspective, and a more popular oracle.
Moot smiled as she disappeared through the door. The celebration of the Eye's return carried on for days. Wave after wave of beer and wine threatened to overtake the shores of the banquet tables, but the imagined gods fulfilled the mandate to eat and drink almost as fast as each was replenished. They lifted up their voices in song, moved their bodies in jubilation, all for the benefit of the mistress of the red headband, who reciprocated by providing the raw materials for even more jubilation. By the end of the third day, most of the citizens wandered off in shifts to sleep and feast upon their dreams. Near the end of the week, even those who would not content themselves with mere dreams of celebration began to fade, some sleeping in the courtyards where they had moments ago been dancing. In time, even the gods required rest. They smiled at their children and retired to their homes, not bothering to wave goodbye to anyone, as the gods are never far from each other or us. Ra wandered the palace gardens in the darkness, a distant drumbeat providing a mechanical counterpoint to the chirping insects and rustling leaves of the fig and willow trees. The king followed the path he had always followed, around the perimeter at first, then snaking back and forth between and around carefully planned clumps of sedges and flowers before beginning all over again. He walked, as he sometimes did, with his eyes closed, following the path marked by variances in fragrance.
It's late,
said a cheerful voice behind him when he had almost finished his first circuit. He turned around and saw Hethert sitting at the edge of a small pond, nestled between flowering plants as if she meant to join them and put down roots at the water's edge.
Yes, it is.
He couldn't help smiling.
You are the loveliest flower in the garden, even after all you've been enjoying the festivals these long days. How is it that you're never wearied by all of this?
He waved a hand back toward the faint music. She shrugged, still grinning.
It's what I do.
He walked over to his daughter and sat down next to her, a small narcissus patch between them at the water's edge.
I'm very tired.
He sighed. It was plain from his expression that this was not the tiredness born of excessive party-going. She kept her silence and listened to her father contemplate his own for long moments.
How sweet the air is here,
he said, stretching out his legs before him and leaning back on his outstretched arms. It was an undignified posture, one no one else would ever be allowed to see. This was exactly the sort of thing that Hethert's very presence encouraged. This was another of her strange talents that he had missed.
How sweet my daughter's presence, and the cool water of the pond that reflects the sweet starry heavens.
She hummed happily beside him.
I know that I am not what interferes with your own happiness,
she said at last. She rolled onto her side to face him as she lounged, reaching a toe out to touch the pond. Ra watched the tiny ripples roll out across the black water.
No, not today. Not tonight.
He grew still, kept his eyes on the water. Hethert watched in silence. She leaned her face closer to a blossom and inhaled the scent, never taking her eyes off the king.
Do you remember who you were before there was time or self?
He turned to look at her. She nodded and sat up. She crept closer to sit next to Ra, where she leaned her head upon his chest.
I remember too. Every day. Sometimes I look at the water at night and I want to go back.
Going back never works.
She shook her head.
You can only go forward from the beginning, even at the end. Starting over isn't going backward, it's the opposite. Always working, stretching, progressing, reaching. Maybe your problem is that you have yet to break the surface.
You might be right about that.
Well, there's a first time for everything.
Yes, at least one.
He wrapped an arm around Hethert and kissed her forehead. She sat up, taller, and wrapped her arms around him, cradling him as he had held her. He leaned into her, resting his head on her chest.
I may yet be what my people need, but I cannot rule them as I have up until now.
They do need you. We all need you to shine for us all.
She held him close. He seemed smaller in her arms now. A child, an infant, a bud straining to emerge. Still, he held back.
I must speak with my grandson,
he said, urgency struggling with the distance that unconsciously washed over his voice.
He knows, dearest,
she said, stroking his cheek.
All who listen to Ma'at know.
She kissed his forehead, as much to reassure herself as him.
What did she tell you?
She asked. Her voice sounded far away to both of them.
Bring the flood.
In speaking it, he knew that he had caused it to be. Without another word, she remembered who she had been before time, before self. She called it forth from then and from deep within her essential nature, bent her head low, and, placing her father there, lifted him up to hold him between the two great horns that curved from the top of her head. She spilled forth, exceeding her own banks and overtaking the pool, washing over the garden and the palace walls, rising above the city, dwarfing the mountains. She strained against a sudden urge to cling to earth. She loomed above the sleeping people who dreamed of sunsets and stars. She cast her shadow over gods who watched and knew the cosmic song that quietly sang up from the edge of a garden and carried itself beyond all comprehension. She trembled, uncertain for a moment as she reached the dizzy heights halfway to her station. The great sky cow moaned. Some of the watching gods rushed to her, appearing exactly on cue to steady each shaking leg. They steadied her and coaxed her on. She spread herself out thinner. The wind, her father, blew and helped her reach higher, ever higher. Supported, calmed by Shu and her other attendants, she opened her eyes at last upon her own vastness. Stars glistened in her eddies and bowed their heads to her majesty as she flowed around them. She looked up at Ra, nestled and quiet, resting in the curve of her horns, her young son once again on his way to the newest of mornings.
Now,
rumbled the deep, sweet voice of Mehet-Weret.
Now there is the flood that is not a flood, for there is nothing here to hear us call it flood. The flood is the sky and the ground. It is everything that could ever be, and it is us, son. You are a blossom rising from your secret roots that even I have never questioned, reaching for the surface, but there is no surface to be found. And so I swell and strain and hold you close. I lift you up from the water between my great horns, and I carry you through the new water, the water of the sky, so that you might be renewed in peace at last and shine.
And so she was,
said the quiet voice that lingered below. Hethert, the first appearance at the beginning, rose to her feet, smiled up at the rising sun, and raised her hands in jubilation to properly greet the first light of dawn.
And so you are.
She dipped a toe in the pond again and watched the ripples reflect his renewing radiance.
And that's all for this episode of the Kemetic Storytellers. Thank you for listening to our show. If you'd like to know more about the stories we read, please see the description below.